It's terrific to be with you all this morning, and I'm so glad I caught something of your very interesting remarks.
This is very good, David. I hope to catch all of it, but I got a bit waylaid on the way down. But it was terrific, just admiring the extraordinary presentation and the lovely pictures. I have to admit, I have no visual aids with me, so I wore a red pocket handkerchief, just to give you something to look at. But I have to say that this is a very interesting occasion. It's great to be in Chennai, such a gorgeous city. And it's particularly interesting to be in Chennai for, I think, the first time in the last half a century that you have a chief minister who has no connection to the film industry. Screenwriters, producers, actors, actresses, what's this poor gentleman going to do now to follow those acts? Actually, I was reminded of a completely unrelated matter. When I used to be in college, we had a bunch of friends who were interested in debating and speaking. And we had this habit of practicing drawing up rules as to how you should do public speaking. And one of our rules was, you must never begin a speech with the cliche. Cliche like, it gives me great pleasure. Everyone began their speech in those days with the words, it gives me great pleasure to be here, and so on. So we would draw up little topics on slips of paper, put them into a bowl, pick up a topic, and then speak according to those rules. So we would make sure that we observed all the rules we had agreed needed to be observed. So as I said, one of the key principles was never begin a speech with a cliche. Well, a fellow friend of mine drew a topic from the bowl, and it was cinema. So he said, it gives me great pleasure, and he sat down again. Which is one way of dealing with rules that you don't particularly want to follow. But I do want to say it still gives me great pleasure to be here. Thank you again, Colonel David, Mr. David, and your team for having invited me to join this Radiant Wellness Conclave. I was very impressed by the list of the 9 kinds of wellness that you're dealing with here. And I must say that few things could be more relevant in our stress-free lives today than the question of our wellness and how we can actually improve it, and how better we can work to improve our wellness in all these 9 categories. Well, it's of course important for us to acknowledge at the same time that wellness is not exactly a new concept in India. We are in many ways the civilization that has paid the most attention to wellness for the longest possible time. Ayurveda, yoga, meditation have all been part of the tradition of this country for millennia. In fact, I think the first reference to dhyana, meditation, can be found in the Vedic texts of 1500 BC. If you look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, talking about yoga and explaining how that can contribute towards the wellness of the mind, body, and soul, that goes back to about 500 BC. So I think it's fair to say that no civilization has actually contributed as much, as early, and for as long to wellness as ours has. But of course, the concept of wellness has also evolved enormously since those ancient days. In fact, if you look at the impact of globalization, of urbanization,
undoubtedly there is a great deal that has come into changing the perspectives that people have about what wellness constitutes. In fact, the pace of life of our era in this incredibly stress-filled world has been a dominant feature of what has detracted from our wellness. There's no question that we live in an era of, and have been for the last 30, 40 years, an era of fast food, of fast life, of fast cars, fast girlfriends for some, and nowadays of bullet trains. So everything has been speeded up. And the question of how the social, occupational aspects of wellness have occupied people's minds has also transformed the way in which people considered it to be ideal at one point to start a career and stay in it for the rest of their lives. They were well, occupationally, just to take one of these topics at random, they were well when they stayed in one predictable, fixed career or company or organization for their entire life. Well, today, I'm afraid the report suggests that this kind of era of the lifer, the person loyal to one institution, one company, one organizational system, has gone because a recent study has said that today's graduates will change their jobs on average 4 times before they turn 32. So that is the kind of transformation we've seen. I think there was time you left the military after 25 years, and then you set up these companies. That's one transition. I've had a similar experience. I spent even longer than him, 29 years in the United Nations system before coming into the world of Indian politics. But people changing 4 jobs and organizations before they get to 32 is, to me, certainly a new way of looking at what makes people feel well and right about their occupation. And the traditional understanding of wellness in terms of human health has also evolved in all sorts of ways. There is no question, for example, since I mentioned cinema in the context of Chennai, that film and television have transformed our image of what a well person should look like. Let's face it, if we look at earlier eras of sculptures and paintings, well people were rather well endowed as well, right? Today now we've got this image of people being terribly slim. Body image has been identified with a certain kind of slimness and fitness. Just a generation ago, when I got to the US as a graduate student in the mid-70s, the only context in which the expression six-pack was used was for beer. You'd buy a 6-pack of beer. Those days have gone now. Now, of course, we all know about the 6-packs of our Bollywood stars. In fact, Shah Rukh Khan did me the honor of attending the launch of my book, Pax Indica, a few years ago. And he said to me, I said, what is this Pax Indica? Is it about a Desi exercise program? I'm glad they didn't add in a Tata car, but the fact is that now 6-packs have gone into the national vocabulary as an indication of physical fitness and health. And I was just thinking back of the days in the mid-1700s when Maharaja Savai Madho Singh of Jaipur was supposed to be a great figure, considered an embodiment of his nation's health, wealth, strength, and so on. The gentleman was 4 feet wide and weighed 250 kilograms. And now you can imagine that today he would not be seen as an advertisement for wellness, but in those days he was absolutely the epitome of what people aspired to and admired in his kingdom. So the world has changed, our perspectives on all this have transformed, and today, of course, we all have to be very conscious of the importance of our physical health. I remember beginning to feel old when people used to come and give me on my birthday pedometers to encourage me to walk. Now, of course, we don't need pedometers anymore because your phone carries an app, or you can download one if you haven't got it already, that will give you a detailed blow-by-blow and somewhat embarrassing account of the number of steps you have walked during the day. And of course, many of you are probably going around, not me, I just have a watch, but many have a Fitbit around their wrists, measuring all their vital indicators to make sure how healthy and fit they are. But what does wellness mean at the individual level? After all, we've now come around to a global consensus that taking care of ourselves is critical to our success in life, to our ability to achieve our goals, and therefore to be well, to be healthy, to be fit, to be well of mind, to be well in all these ways, spiritually and occupationally and socially and so on, that all that is essential to accomplish our success in life. That happiness flows from wellness, that our job satisfaction comes from being well, that even our emotional connect to people requires wellness. But what about something like social wellness? At the level of our society, what should it mean for India, for example, to look at wellness? We have, as you know, potentially a huge demographic dividend staring us in the face. And that comes from the fact that we are a very young society. Our population is extraordinarily young. 50.1% of our population is under 25, and 65% are under 35. How many in this room under 35? Minority. So it clearly looks like those above 35 are the ones who want to think more about wellness, and there's a good reason for that. But let me tell you why I mentioned the young. It is that if you look really at our numbers, we are a young society while the rest of the world is aging. So by 2020, which of course is not that far away, the average age of people in Europe or European countries will be 46. In Japan, the average age will be 47. Even in youthful immigrant-fueled America, it'll be 40. In India, it'll be 29. So we will have a young population who's able, therefore, to work, to be the dynamic, youthful workforce, the engine of the world economy that, as we all know, China has been for the last generation. But the numbers don't even stop there. If you look at the ILO, the International Labour Organization's figures, they have said that by 2020, we will have 116 million young people in the job-starting age group of 20 to 24, whereas China will be down to just 94 million. So in other words, even a country like China, which has been the major workforce of the world, will not be in a position to compete with us, even in absolute numbers. In fact, you can look further at the fact that labor force around the world is shrinking. In the industrialized countries of the West, it's shrinking by 4%. In China, it's shrinking by 5% a year. In India, our labor force is growing by 32%. But of course, there is a catch. This demography works for us. This could be a demographic dividend, as I said, but it could also be a demographic disaster. Why? Because if we are unable to educate or skill these young people to take advantage of the opportunity that demography provides them in the world's globalized economy, to be able to provide the kind of engine to transform the world that China has been able to provide in the last generation, if we can't do that, if we can't equip them to take these jobs, then I'm sorry to say the demographic dividend could be a demographic disaster, a social nightmare, because as we know from the Maoist violence, the Naxalite violence that has assailed 165 of our country's 625 districts, the Maoist violence is proof that the most dangerous thing for our future would be literally legions of undereducated or uneducated, unskilled or inadequately skilled or wrongly skilled young people, particularly young men, who are therefore unemployed and unemployable and therefore have no stake in our society, because if they feel they can't benefit, they can't get jobs, they can't get a decent salary, they are vulnerable to the blandishments of 1,000 rupees and a Kalashnikov, which is what the Maoists offer their recruits and take them along. So for us, this is a question of social wellness in the absolute sense. That is, that our society must be able to skill, educate, and train our young so that we can, first of all, prevent the worst happening, and second, ensure that the best happens, that we become the engine of the world economy as we are capable of. Look at the obvious advantages of better wellness for every young mind in our society. There will, of course, be higher productivity. There will be less antisocial behavior, less criminal behavior, less political violence. The rising costs of healthcare in our country are also a matter of serious concern. It's striking that all of you are, or so many of you, 90% of you are over 35, because there are other studies that show that 80% of India's healthcare expenditure is conducted by people in the second half of their lives. So you are the people spending money on healthcare. And I have to say that it becomes incredibly important that we actually take proactive steps to ensure that wellness is promoted so that you don't have to have colossal amounts of expenditure as you get to my age and beyond. Indeed, This is not a small matter because our country is rampant with non-communicable diseases, the so-called lifestyle diseases. You know, we have a great cuisine. I'm an absolute chauvinist about Indian cuisine. I joke about how in Britain today, Indian curry houses, as they're called, Indian restaurants in Britain, employ more people than the coal mining, iron and steel, and shipbuilding industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Our cuisine is wonderful, but our cuisine was created for an outdoor culture, a rural culture, a culture in which people walked a lot, climbed a lot, whether it was climbing mountains or climbing trees. We were a relatively fit people, and so our food is rich. It's rich in carbohydrates, it's rich in sugars, it's rich in oils and fat and so on. Deep fried foods are a staple of our cuisine. But what does all that mean when today the best form of exercise we have is picking up a remote and changing the channel on our television? I used to joke, not entirely wisely, that the only exercise I enjoy is jumping to conclusions. But this is a conclusion one has to jump at. There are increasing incidents of diabetes, of heart disease, of various kinds of lifestyle illnesses, also linked to what we consume and to the fact that as our culture has become more urban, more sedentary, more quiet, we have not been able to transform the way we eat, the way we behave, the way we walk, the way we are chauffeured from place to place, and all of these things that limit very much our ability to prevent lifestyle diseases, to prevent illnesses of a serious nature. And then we have air quality. I remember a diplomat friend of mine who was a stout non-smoker was doing his exit medical after 3 years service in an Indian city and was asked by his headquarters how many packs of cigarettes he smoked a day. So he reacted with horror saying, "I don't smoke, I've never smoked in my life." And they said, "Your lungs tell a different story." And his lungs reflected essentially the mere habit of breathing Indian city air. There was a wonderful old song by Tom Lehrer in America in the 60s, which said, "If you visit American city, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware: don't drink the water and don't breathe the air." Now that is where we are in India today. In any Indian city, you can sing the same song. And it's particularly unfortunate because in a city like Delhi, in a city like Calcutta, and I'm sorry to say Chennai is not that far behind, I've looked at the numbers, we are looking at an air pollution crisis that is affecting our lungs, that is affecting our health, that is dramatically adding to respiratory disease, that is actually shortening the lives of children, and that is putting us in a position in which we as a people are unnecessarily damaging our own future and our own wellness by the mere act of breathing. You know, our yoga has created pranayama as an exercise. Wake up in the morning and breathe. Well, I'm sorry, if you do pranayama in many Indian cities, you're actually facilitating the entry of more pollutants and chemicals into your lungs. That is the reality. Sit in an air-conditioned room instead. You're safer. And it's not a good idea. I mean, the fact is that this is the kind of development that I speak of with despair. I'm not just speaking. I convened a roundtable of experts, the Director General of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, NGO activists, doctors, and celebrities, and some MPs to discuss air quality in Delhi. And I organized it precisely in order to hope we can goad our country towards coming up with a plan of action to improve air quality in India. So I think one more thing we need to add in that list of 9 is environmental wellness, because we don't have it. And this is just one example. One example of it. But you know, wellness in the larger sense, in the absolute sense, the holistic sense, as I know the Davids like to say, that wellness is, of course, extremely important for our society as a whole, for a country as a whole. Much of what I've been talking about in the last 15 years in many of my speeches have been about India's soft power. And what is soft power but precisely the ability to tell the better story? And when I say to tell the better story, I don't mean propaganda. Because PR has its limitations, as our Prime Minister is discovering after 3 years. You can make wonderful speeches, you can sell a beautiful package, but when people realize the package is empty, then of course, unfortunately, you face up to the fact that your message alone cannot substitute for people's real experience. So when I say we must be the land of the better story, I mean that when people think of India, the immediate associations must be positive stories. That was the kind of image India used to have, the country of great tolerance and harmony and coexistence, the country in which people of a dizzying variety of differences, caste, creed, color, culture, consonant, cuisine, custom and costume, all still managed to rally around a consensus. And that consensus in India was on the wonderful principle that in a rich, diverse democracy like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. So we managed to maintain consensus on how to manage without consensus. And that has been a very, very big strength of India. That has been the better story, the story of a land of freedom, of opportunity, of NGOs, of human rights organizations, of a free press, a land where everyone was allowed to be everything they wanted to be, a land in which, as some Arabs said to me with astonishment in 2004 when I was traveling in the Gulf on behalf of the United Nations, they couldn't believe that our country's election had just produced a victory for a political party led by a woman leader of Italian background and Catholic heritage, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as Prime Minister by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. And they said, my God, what an astonishing country you are. So that is the land of the better story. That is the story that we are not trying to tell the world. This is just India being itself. No one ever thought that we were going to do all this in order to impress the world. But when the rest of the world sees what we're not trying to tell them, but what we just are being for ourselves, that makes India the land of the better story. But when, sadly, these kinds of narratives are replaced by narratives of mob lynchings and cow vigilantism and all of these things, that can undermine the wellness of our society, not only internally, but in the outside world's perception of what we are. What is the India story that they read about in their newspapers and in the world? So that's an extremely important thing to understand as well. Now, there are, of course, traditional assets in our soft power from wellness. I mentioned Ayurveda. It has been estimated recently that Ayurveda potentially could be a $60 billion market worldwide. There's an estimate that there is a global sort of herbal industry worth $120 billion, and that Ayurveda could easily capture half of it. Yoga has been very effectively marketed by our government. The adoption by the United Nations of International Yoga Day has meant that now every year on one day you'll see in various world capitals all sorts of glamorous and not so glamorous people performing contortions and poses in the middle of Paris or London or of course Delhi. My own favorite posture is Shavasana, but there are others who can do other things far more effectively. And we do that in a way that certainly gets a lot of attention. In fact, I was so struck when I was in Portugal that our ambassador in Lisbon, Nandini Singla, not only does yoga, but she actually has a daily yoga class in her house that's attended by the ambassadors of 8 other countries. So 8 other ambassadors in Portugal are coming to the Indian ambassador's house to do yoga, and naturally when they move on to their next postings, they will go away with a very interesting aspect of goodwill towards our country and our culture when they go. This whole business of the way in which these
aspects of our lives have made an impact internationally came home to me this morning when I opened the newspaper and saw that in Rishikesh, they're now setting up a museum to the Beatles. Because the Beatles came and discovered Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's transcendental meditation in 1968. And of course, wrote some great music there, which many of us have heard. And now apparently, the ashrams of Rishikesh are going to be complemented by a Beatles museum in what used to be the Maharishi's ashram. So all of these transformations, there is no question that the whole business of the mind-body soul, wellness, the entire package of meditation, yoga, Ayurveda, all of this, the use of natural therapies, all of this is coming. But there are some legitimate grounds for criticism. I've spoken to some very serious Ayurveds who say that this entire rise of Ayurveda is something they disapprove of, because Ayurveda is not about going off and getting a massage, as many people think it is, or taking a lotion, a kashayam, at specific intervals during the day. He says the entire concept of Ayurveda is holistic. It is about treating the person, not treating the illness. That the concept of Ayurveda is the doctor diagnoses the person as a whole, and the treatment for that
person is what essentially remedies the malady or the illness that the person is suffering. And he says, therefore, to have a holistic treatment Ayurveda, you can't go off and, be doing an Ayurvedic treatment for 1 hour and then enjoying a stiff drink at sundown later the same evening. That's not Ayurveda, he says. And he says, in any case, the whole point about these Ayurvedic massages, so-called, is not the massage, it is the oil. Ayurvedic massage is actually oil application. And it's the medicinal content of the oil being applied on your skin that gives you the benefits of wellness that Ayurveda prescribes, and not the actual rubbing, not the actual massage itself. And that therefore, he says, when you see these so-called Ayurvedic massages being advertised, that is not real Ayurveda. Now, I thought about that, I was very impressed. And then I realized, I'm going to have to trouble you for a little bit of water if I might, And then I realized that, in fact, thank you so much, that in fact, if you look at the way in which we study these things, we are perhaps being unnecessarily purist. Because if somebody comes and just has 24 hours in a 5-star hotel, gets himself an Ayurvedic treatment, sleeps better that night, and goes away the next day feeling a little rejuvenated, what's wrong with that? It may not be pure Ayurveda, it may not be the total mind-body healing that the purists would want, but it gives you a sense of wellness which can be repeated at will. And I am prepared to say that a certain amount of compromise on that purity may be all right, because we also have to accommodate to what people find it possible and convenient to do. There are very few people in the world who can completely recreate an Ayurvedic lifestyle and eat even breakfasts and lunches prescribed by the Ayurveda, and have their medicines and their oil applications and live the tranquil life that they are supposed to. Those days are gone. So if we can adapt the great triumphs of Ayurveda to the realities of today's world, that may include having to compromise a little bit on purity. But my own thought is also underscored by the fact that if our ancient systems of Ayurveda, yoga, meditation were able to unlock the creative juices, the creative talents of Steve Jobs and the Beatles, then it couldn't be all that bad, right? So if we can do it there for them, maybe if we adopt our own traditions, we might ourselves be producing a few Steve Jobses and a few Beatles in this society. I'm a huge devotee, therefore, of tourism as the answer to many of our socioeconomic lack of wellness challenges in our society. First of all, because tourism, I've discovered that a lakh of rupees invested in tourism will actually generate 8 times more jobs than the same lakh of rupees invested in industry, in any other industry. And that means that we are overlooking, by not emphasizing tourism much more, we are overlooking the fantastic potential that tourism has to actually create employment for the unskilled and semi-skilled young people of our country whom I talked about earlier. The more hotels, the more tourist places, the more restaurants, and the more wellness centers we establish, it seems to me the more we can actually do. And it was very interesting to see a recent FICCI report, Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, which says that the wellness industry could be key in this respect. Apparently, the wellness industry today is worth about 85,000 crores, that it will grow at a compounded annual growth rate of 12%. Now, there's pretty much no other industry that can come close to that. And this is in the next 5 years. FICCI study is for the next 5 years. And they say it will reach 1.5 trillion rupees in value by 2020. This means that what Radhika David is doing in running the Radiant Wellness Conclave and the Radiant Wellness Centers itself is actually very much in a sunrise industry, that going on in this way will give us the opportunity to create not just wellness in terms of people's health, wellness in society, but also economic wellness for our country and our people, as well as actually the investors and entrepreneurs themselves. It's interesting, for example, to realize that agriculture is slated to lose 2.5 crore workers by 2022. 2.5 crore people who are working on the farms today will not be able to work on the farms can't sustain them, right? Whereas the wellness industry will, if it grows like this as FICCI projects, will employ 1.4 crore people in these next 5 years, even as others are losing jobs in agriculture. I'm not saying that every unemployed farmer should learn how to do an Ayurvedic massage, but maybe that too is not, we keep talking about jargon terms like upskilling and reskilling and retraining and so on. When people leave professions that cannot sustain them and they look for professions that they can do well in, wellness is an extremely positive profession to turn towards. In fact, it is the fastest job creator of any industry in India today. And that's one of the reasons I agreed to come here, because I believe this is a sunrise industry and that wellness is very much the way of the future for our country. Now, this does mean, however, that we need to change people's mindsets. We need to encourage an appreciation of wellness in the young. We need to do this in the schools. We need to do this at all stages of people's experience. We need to persuade the workplace that employees spending time on wellness pursuits is not time wasted, but time that will actually make them more productive and for longer in the workplace as well. So mindsets have to be changed everywhere. And mindsets are simply about the kind of assumptions with which we approach any problem. In fact, one of my favorite stories about assumptions and mindsets has nothing to do with wellness, but I'll tell it anyway because you've been listening to me so patiently. It's a story about an American agricultural expert who comes to India in the days before the Green Revolution, when the Americans still were trying to advise us on farming. And this chap comes to this Indian farm, as usual, with all our population pressures, some of our land reforms and so on. The farm is fairly small, not much larger than this lovely auditorium we're in today. But the American says to the Indian farmer, so which all is your land? And the Indian farmer very proudly says, my land goes all the way to that national highway. And the American looks and he sees what to him is a dirt track. He says, oh, and then he turns to the Indian and says, and then the Indian says, and do you see that irrigation canal? And the American looks, he sees a trickle of water out there. He says, my land goes all the way up to there. And it's this, as I said, about the size of this auditorium. And then the farmer turns to the American and says, what about you? And the American is a farmer from a prairie Midwestern place like Kansas or somewhere where the wheat fields roll on for miles on end. And he has vast, vast thousands and millions of acres of land. So this farmer says, well, he says, in the morning I get into my tractor and I drive 2.5 hours south to the southern boundary of my land. Then it takes me 3 hours to the western boundary of my land in my tractor. Then I stop, I break for a sandwich. Then it takes me another 3 hours in my tractor to the northern boundary of my land. Then it soon becomes sundown and I get into my tractor and I have to drive another 1.5 hours in my tractor to my ranch house. He finds the Indian farmer nodding very sympathetically. I know, says the Indian. I too used to have a tractor like that. So the point of the story, other than trying to cheer you up in the middle of a long speech, is that what you understand depends on what your assumptions are. What are your assumptions with which you hear a story, the assumptions with which you understand a problem, the assumptions with which you react to a problem? And if your assumptions are ones that incorporate core ideas of wellness from a very young age, then everything you do will correspond to one of these 9 criteria, or the 10th one I suggested, and we will have, as a result, a society dedicated, a country dedicated to wellness. But if our assumptions, unfortunately, are the ones they are today, then it seems to me we will be doing ourselves great damage, and we will need more conclaves to correct all the things we're doing wrong, rather than celebrate and point to the things we should be doing right. And I do want to say that when I speak about wellness in this larger holistic sense, I do want also to celebrate a few good things about the way in which we as a society have attempted to change our assumptions and use our mental aptitude to face up to some of the great challenges that India faces in the 21st century. For example, if you were to Google the phrase frugal innovation, you'll find the first 20 hits will all relate to Indian innovations. In fact, India's reputation for doing things innovatively, creatively, is now remarkably widespread. I know many of you in the South have understandable resistance to Hindi, but there is this whole question of jugaad, the notion that you can create informal arrangements. So jugaad, for example, has included a farmer putting a hand pump, an irrigation hand pump, on a cart and converting it into a motorized vehicle to move his goods. In fact, even something as simple as the Indian invention of the missed call, right? So you send your kids off to university, they don't have enough pocket money to pay their phone bills, so if they want you to call them, they'll give you one ring and you know it's them and you call them back. All of this is the way in which we innovate to find Indian solutions to these various problems. In fact, if you look at how we've been able to strip many things to their bare essentials, make them affordable, make them adapted, make them relevant and durable for our society and our culture. Indeed, we can see bigger examples of this. The Tata Nano may have seemed to many to be a marketing disaster in India, but as an innovative product, it's been a huge success. It swept the admiration of people at the Geneva Auto Show, the way in which a car costing $2,000, which is about the cost of a high-end DVD player in a fancy car in the West, suddenly could do all of these things. A car which in many ways, as you know, came up with innovations no one had ever thought possible, like moving the wheels to the edge of the chassis so that it could create more space, or creating an aluminum engine instead of steel to reduce the weight of the engine on the car, eliminating the side view mirrors, all sorts of creative things which actually in many ways show a capacity for innovation that we should be able to celebrate. Or our Mars mission, the Mangalyaan mission, extraordinary that it cost just $74 million, which is lower than the cost of the budget of the Hollywood space movie Gravity. It was 11% of the cost of NASA's Mars Explorer mission at exactly the same time. And then, of course, I can come up with so many other examples. We have the world's cheapest electrocardiogram, which is a fraction of the cost of the cardiogram machines elsewhere in the West, so that today an Indian villager can get a cardiogram done for just $1 equivalent. Or the famous Swatch filter using discarded rice husks from our paddy fields, which is a filter that is 1/20th the cost of the nearest competing water filter available in the world. All of these things, it seems to me, suggest that innovation as a way of promoting wellness in our society becomes extremely important. And think about, for example, the hepatitis B vaccines have been invented. It used to cost $15 an injection in the West. Thanks to an Indian biotech company, one shot of a hepatitis B vaccine is now 10 cents. So all of these things, when you think of the people in our country and around the world who die of heart disease, who die of hepatitis, who drink contaminated water and die of that, I think we lose about 5 million people a year in India to heart attacks, about 2 million people a year to drinking contaminated water. Think how much these innovations are contributing to the wellness of our society. And in fact, if you really want innovations that actually address problems that Indians face, I was thrilled to hear from Professor Mashelkar about the winner of his first prize on innovation. He's giving a prize in the name of his late mother. And Professor Mashelkar told me that, we have 15 million people in this country who are blind, and many of them are blind because of preventable reasons. they develop glaucoma, they develop cataracts and so on. They don't get themselves tested, they don't get themselves treated. And why? Because very often they're too poor. If you go, for example, for a glaucoma test, they will put drops in your eyes that give you fuzzy and blurred vision for many hours afterwards. If you have fuzzy and blurred vision and you're a manual laborer working on daily wage, you can't do your job that day. If you don't do your job that day, you don't get a daily wage. If you don't get a wage that day, your family doesn't eat. So result, you don't go test your eyes. So what Professor Mashilka gave the prize to was an innovator who came up with an eye test for glaucoma and cataracts that does not require the eyes to become fuzzy for the next few hours. So there is an idea of an innovation for wellness which actually contributes to the wellness, not just the health of the person, but also his economic well-being. These are the kinds of solutions we need to see in our country. At the same time, you know, I know that one word that was used in the literature about this conference was disruption. I haven't used it because I think, frankly, we've seen a little too much disruption in recent years, demonetization being a very good example, a colossal disaster for which it's very difficult to find any defensible thing to say, since every single goalpost that was announced for the reasons for demonetization, the goalposts kept moving, but even the new goalposts also, the ball wasn't kicked into them. So whether it was against terrorism or against counterfeiting or against black money or for a cashless economy, none of those goals have been met. And we now ask ourselves, what is the purpose of putting the country through the horrors of demonetization? The 106 people who lost their lives in demonetization-related tragedies, from dropping dead in queues 8 hours long in the hot sun to cases of domestic violence when husbands discovered the money that their wives had saved all those years. No, sadly, 2 women have been murdered because of demonetization by husbands, and there have been countless examples of domestic violence going up as well. So disruption is something which I would rather not see in our society of that nature. But having said that, there are, in the normal course of our society, horrendously disruptive events taking place. Farmer suicides, for example. I was so struck by the Tamil Nadu farmers coming up to Delhi and stripping themselves to show how little they had and the desperate conditions they were in because of this government's policies. And when you look at these things, the question that comes up to people's minds is, how do we manage to ensure that without disrupting the lives of ordinary people, we can promote their wellness and their socioeconomic wellness in our society? To my mind, economic growth is all very well. I applaud the government whenever they're able to achieve something positive in that regard. But I do want to say that whether we grow by 9% as we did under the previous government or by 5.7% as we're going under this government, what really matters in our society is the bottom 25% of our population, those who are living below the poverty line in conditions that really, that's a poverty line that's been drawn barely this side of the funeral pyre. We cannot afford to forget them from any definition of the wellness of Indian society as a whole. There are, of course, various ways we can measure wellness and poverty line and so on. The Bhutanese have said GDP is not the right thing. We should have a measure called gross national happiness. And their argument is very good. You know, in conventional economics, if you chop down 10 trees, you add to the GDP because the economic value of that chopped wood is greater than the value of the tree growing on the mountain. Whereas Bhutan says, no, 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 we must have happiness. And because a pure air supported by lots of trees contributes to the happiness of our people, that is more important than chopping down those trees and adding to the GDP. So there are various measures possible of economic and social wellness in our society, but I think it's extremely important that for us in India, that we use wellness measures to identify the most vulnerable groups that we can actually give assistance to and help to, so that when those who are marginalized, those who are suffering, those who are excluded, I mean, there are how many families in our country where a serious illness for one person, the earning member of the family, destroys the entire family's life. The savings go, sometimes they have to sell the land to treat the person's illness, and the result very often is a horrendous tragedy. We need to disrupt that system, create more meaningful health insurance schemes, give protection to our people, and promote their wellness from the very, very start. At the end, it's about greater productivity, greater innovation for all our people. And as far as I'm concerned, I've got a warning here saying my time is up. I'm trying to skip the last few points very quickly. Let me just say that as far as as far as the potential of this wellness sector to contribute to the nation's success. I think a sector that can create 1.4 crore jobs, that can bring in so much of money and prosperity to the economy, and that can be itself a catalyst for positive change is something that I would very much value. And I want to end with a very simple reference to this whole holistic idea of wellness as a whole. Because one of my favorite Puranic stories is a story which goes back a very long time, but seems to me to be utterly timeless. And that is a story about how all of this wellness can essentially be brought down to the simple concept of social harmony. And it's a story about a sage and his disciples. And the sage says to his disciples, "When does the night end?" And the disciple from the south, probably from my state, always trying to be too smart, said, I know. He says, the night ends when the dawn begins. And the sage says, I know that, but when does the night end and the dawn begin? And the young man says, when the first shafts of sunlight illuminate the palm fronds on the coconut trees, swaying gently in the breeze above the paddy fields, that is when the night ends and the day begins, and the dawn begins. So the sage says, no, my son, that's not quite right. So he turns to the other disciple, who's from the northern part of our country, and that boy says, I know, sage, it's when those first streaks of sunlight glint off the snow and ice on the mountain tops of the Himalayas, and you can see the dazzling whiteness of the snow reflected in the first rays of the sun. That is when the night ends and the dawn begins. The sage says, no, my son. This is when two travelers from the farthest ends of our land meet together, embrace each other as brothers, and know that they sleep under the same sky, see the same stars, and dream the same dreams. That is when the night ends and the dawn begins. We have seen many a dark night in the complicated, tragic, turbulent, exciting, and very often painful history of our land. Let us all work together to create a greater sense of wellness, for all in all these categories and more, so that we can all wake up to a new dawn. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.